Off the bat, between Gene Cook's prayer and Faith's prayer, they took away about a third of my message to you this morning. So we might as well just get on with it. But I want to start out this morning by saying Happy Father's Day, which I know has already been said. As is normally the rule, we fill the church on Mother's Day, and we have a lot of empty seats on Father's Day. Let's hope it's because the fathers and the children are getting together today on this very special day. You know, Father's Day is interesting, and how it started, of course, is not for secular reasons or some sort of a federal holiday or something, although that followed. It's contained, the honoring our fathers is contained in the second commandment, which you can find, and by the way, I want to tell you all this morning that I am a student of the Bible, and I read my Bible faithfully, and I encourage you all to do so. As a matter of fact, I brought with me this morning a Bible that I bought in 1995, which was 11 years before I was saved. So lest you have a family member or maybe a grandchild or maybe a brother or a sister or something that you've been praying for, sometimes it just takes a long time. And sometimes there's really tough nuts to crack. And I was one of them. So in looking at Exodus chapter 20, Moses has gone up to the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments, and God has given them to him. And what's interesting about fathers is the fourth commandment, which is considered the first commandment with a promise. And it says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long in the land which Jehovah thy God has given thee. And it is from this that we honor fathers. And as Faith said in her prayer, and I think Jean as well, the best expression of fatherhood is in the context of the Christian family. Now, I don't in any way want to imply that fathers can't be good fathers outside of the sacrament of marriage. There are good fathers in the secular world. There are many non-Christians who are good fathers to their children. They love their children, and they bring them up, and they take care of them, and so on and so forth. But the ultimate expression of fatherhood is in the context of the Christian family. And the best thing that a father can do is to love his wife. Because when you love your wife, you are doing more to teach your children what a father is than any other single thing. And trust me, I'm not telling you this out of experience. I'm at least not in most of my life. It took me a long time to come to the Lord. And there were a lot of stumbling blocks I had in the process, and we'll get into that. And I pray today that I will not weep, as often our pastor Faith weeps here. But when you have a strong feeling that comes around you and the Spirit rises up, sometimes the tears flow. I mentioned to her this morning that I had known her and her husband for 15 years. Going back to 2006, in July of 14th of this year, it will have been 20 years since I had been saved. And she was as surprised as I was. I hadn't been counting the years. So in the context of a Christian family, a mother and father who are raising their children in knowledge of the Lord, they are loving one another or attempting to. I just want to mention a few families. The first one would be Dave and Faith. This is my favorite family. I attached myself to these people right after I was saved, and you remember I did. And I've been either a thorn in their side, as well as being one of their biggest supporters for the last 15 years. And there's another family I want to mention, is the family of Ken and Jean Cook. Jean holds a Bible study on Tuesday night, and I've been going to her Bible study at least for 15 years, have I not? Yeah. Sometimes I make it and sometimes I don't. And then there are other families I want to mention who raise their home. My dear friend Chris and his wife Mary Jo, they have raised children in their home. They've raised them in the Christian faith. And none of us are perfect. I want to remind everyone of that. Clayton and Kitty Rayford are here this morning. I absolutely love these two. They were at the Southside Alliance Church when I went there, and again, they're some of my favorite people. And there are others here too. I'm not trying to leave anybody out in this or not. When it comes to fatherhood, I searched through the scriptures to find a perfect father. I was not successful. I did find 3 different men that God claimed were perfect in his own words. And some of them, for instance, God said that King David was perfect in his heart. But he was certainly not a perfect father. Anybody who reads their scriptures knows he was an abject failure as a father. And there's other great men in the Bible. You know, there's Moses and there's Abraham and there's Jacob. I mean, there's plenty of people and you can look for that perfect father and you can't find him. He's not there. And the reason why he's not there is because there aren't any perfect people. In fact, one of the greatest lessons you can get from the Bible is that these people were just like us. They sinned and they fell down, and because they were this way, if you ask yourself the reason why, it's because of the fall, which is outlined very clearly in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and sin entered the world. So there are not only no perfect fathers, there are no perfect families either. And so accept this as you go through life and you attempt to raise your children, and know that there are none perfect. But there is one whom I struggled with. I'll bet you Faith knows who I'm going to go to, too. There is one that I struggled with for years, and that is Job. There was a man in the land of Uz named Job, and the man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and turned away from evil. And even God said this, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and turneth away from evil." So you would think this is a perfect man. And yet if you read through Job, which can be a struggle for many of us, it was for me, you'll find that Job was not perfect. However, Job did something that I suggest that we all do. Because it's so appropriate for us after our children grow and they're no longer in the home, and sometimes we feel powerless as to what to do with our children. It says in the book that Job's sons went and held a feast in the house of each one each day, and they sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And so it was, when the days of the feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning, and he offered burnt offerings according to the number of them. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and renounced God in their heart." Thus Job did continually. So the best thing that we can do for our children is to pray for them. And the reason why, Faith briefly mentioned, is outside the door of this church is a rapidly growing pagan culture that is not only in denial of the role of fatherhood and even the sacrament of marriage, but it's outright hostile to it. And we're sending our children into the world to try to make their way, and it's going to be a difficult, difficult time. I then got to thinking about situations in the Bible where there were fractures that occurred between fathers and sons, and I was looking for resolution of this. It was interesting that in the parable Jesus spoke of the prodigal son. And most of us are familiar with it. The son wandered away from his father. He didn't want anything to do with him after a while. He says, "Just give me the share of my inheritance." And he went out into the world and he sinned. And he spent his money on harlots and easy living and so on and so forth. And when he finally came to his senses, he came back and he said, "Father, forgive me and have mercy upon me." And I thought, well, this is wonderful, because the father did. But there are many, many lessons that can be derived from the story of the prodigal son, not just this particular one. But then I thought, is there any story in there where a father where a son went to his father and forgave him for what the father had done. And I couldn't find one. May be there, perhaps, but I couldn't find it. But I have a story. And I think it's an appropriate story, and I want to tell you why. I was listening to Family Life the other day, and they took a survey of whether or not for people to call in, men to call in, and ask if they had either a positive or a negative response to their father over the years. They said, what's your impression of your father? And the poll showed overwhelmingly that these young men had a negative opinion of their fathers. I was stunned. Negative rather than positive. So Father's Day, maybe in a way, is a good day for these young men to repair their relationship with their father, to visit them, to honor them, even though maybe the relationship over the years has been something other than Christian, or what we would consider to be the Christian ideal. At the same time, when you look at the numbers, if you will, and I didn't want to bring you a lot of numbers this morning, but for instance, in the inner city of our great cities in this country, over 85% of the young men being raised up, and girls too for that matter, are being raised without a father. That's stunning. When you look at the number of teen suicides in the United States, and I realize I'm giving you some negative stuff here, and I apologize for that, but the number of teen suicides in the United States is almost totally concentrated in children who grew up in a home without a father. Alcoholism, drug abuse, almost overwhelmingly children who grew up in a home without a father. The dysfunction is stunning when you think about it. And so there is some sort of a special bond that exists between a father and his children, particularly his male children, since it seems to be males who are the most to engage in, for instance, criminal activity and so on and so forth. There's a special bond there. It's a spiritual thing. And it's amplified in the scriptures. There's a reason why even the genealogies talk about father to son, father to son, father. We're not leaving out the ladies. There's something special in there. And we see that something special reflected in the relationship of Jesus Christ to his own father. And Jesus was bold in his time. He grew up as a Jewish boy where he dare not mention the name of God. And he stood and he said, "My Father, who is in heaven." It's absolutely amazing. This church, and my favorite lady here, Faith, strongly emphasizes the love of God, as it should be. It is foundational. But there is something else that goes hand in hand with love, that without it, love cannot be expressed. And that is forgiveness. It is not possible to love God without him forgiving you first. It's not possible. It can't be done. It is not possible to love your neighbor as yourself without forgiveness. It isn't even possible for you to live with your wife or your husband without forgiveness. It's almost continual. We used to talk about repenting from things when the Spirit prompted us and convicted us, but forgiveness is a willful act that has to be engaged in. You must live your life literally on a daily basis with forgiveness. And I learned after many, many years how to forgive, because I'll tell you right now, for most of my life, I didn't forgive no one. I forgave nobody. If you hurt me, I walked away from you. I never talked to you again. I never had anything to do with you. If we look into the book of Matthew, as I recall, it's the 6th chapter. I don't know. It is. Jesus gives his disciples, in other words, he's giving us as well, the Lord's Prayer. And in the Lord's Prayer, of course, as we know, it says, forgive us our debts, or forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, or forgive our debtors. And then his next words after the prayer is done is he says, for if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And I don't want to come up with some kind of a step that you got to do this or you got to do that in order to be saved. We don't want to enter into that kind of thing. But this is a truism. Sometimes when you research this thing, some people call this a command. It's not a command. It's a statement of fact. Coming to the Lord involves casting off from yourselves spirits that are in charge of you, that are functioning in your life, that are pushing you in a certain direction. Usually they're worldly directions. And in order for you to enter into the family of God, you must reject those things. They must be cast off of you. Spiritually, they must be spewed out, if you will, so that you can take in the Spirit of God, who will then guide you, as Jesus says, follow me, in the path of our Savior, Jesus Christ. It cannot be done without forgiveness. The forgiveness you receive from the Father and the forgiveness we give to those who have hurt you and hurt us in our lives. You can't receive the forgiveness of God into your heart until you empty out the stuff that is in you. It's not possible. So today I'm speaking to people who are carrying in themselves a spirit of unforgiveness, and it can be anybody. It doesn't necessarily have to be toward your father. It could be to anybody, and I'm just urging you that in order for you to unburden yourself and to receive more from God, you have to forgive. It has to come out. If the people are alive that have hurt you, go to them and ask their forgiveness. But as King David even said, after committing adultery and even murder, he says, it is against you, O Lord, and only you that I have sinned. And that's the primary person who we go to when we ask forgiveness, is we go to the Lord. Christian homes, raising up children, even before I was saved, I tended to fail with my two natural children, my boys. But then when I remarried and I had 3 stepchildren, I had 2 girls and a boy, and the boy was very young. He was like 4 at the time, so he doesn't remember his own father. He only remembers me. And Pat and I attempted to raise our children in the church. It was a Catholic church, but it was a good church. And oftentimes we went to church with them, and sometimes I went with them or she went with them. We sent them through Catholic school. I worked the bingo halls at Notre Dame when they were in high school. So we made an effort to raise them in knowing the Lord, even though I myself was not seeking the Lord and did not start until the mid-90s. I think it was 1995, I bought this Bible. This is a NIV Bible, because I had an experience in the hospital where I had gone to the hospital very, very sick, and my liver was failing. And I know some of you have heard this story, but this is what prompted me to start reading the Bible, to read the Gospels. And I was in the St. Joseph's Hospital, and after 2 days in the hospital, my liver function had fallen from 64, where it was when my wife put me in on a Sunday, and I think it was on a Tuesday night, it had fallen to 52. And I had my general physician and 3 specialists stand at the foot of my bed and tell me that if it went below 50, that I probably wouldn't survive. And they had no idea what was wrong with me. Strange things have happened to me in my life, as Faith can attest to. And they were sending my blood all over the country trying to figure out what was wrong with me, and no one knew. And so for the first time in my adult life, I actually prayed. And I didn't know too many prayers. I knew the Lord's Prayer, and I said that. My marriage was so shaky that I never even called my wife to tell them what the doctor said. And I went to sleep that night not knowing if I was going to wake the next day, I could have died. And the next morning, a young girl came running into my room saying, Mr. Keller, your liver function is up to 53. And it rapidly recovered. It's interesting, the head of the hospital, I can't remember her name now, was Sisters. It was a Catholic hospital at the time, but she actually came to my room on a Thursday night, Friday morning, maybe it was, I think it was Thursday night, and asked me to stay, although my insurance company was trying to kick me out because I was recovering so well, and just so that they could keep collecting blood to find out what happened to me. And I might add as well that no cause was ever found for that over the years. They were in contact with me as much as 5 years later. Absolute mystery as to what happened to me. Maybe God was trying to get my attention. So after that, I started to read the Gospels. I read them faithfully. And I started talking to God. Mostly in my garden. I like to have a vegetable garden every year, and I would be out there in the backyard, and I would just talk to him. The scary part is one day he answered. Sometimes the thing in your heart that God has to overcome is something you're not even aware of. You become so used to it after a while. I didn't grow up in a good home, and yes, I know you've probably heard 100 stories of children growing up in abusive homes with abusive fathers, but the bottom line is the abusive father is not just an abusive father. Sometimes the father is gone from the home. And when I say gone, it doesn't mean he doesn't live there. It means he's just not there. He's not there to encourage you. He's not there to do anything. In my home, there was violence involved. My mother and dad, this was back when, right after World War II. I was born in the beginning of World War II, and my only memories of my mother and father were that my father had committed a terrible sin, and I'm not going to dishonor him by telling you what it was, a terrible sin at some point in their marriage, and she never let him forget it. She constantly brought it up, and then the battles would begin, and all of the children, there were 5 of us, we would literally run and hide. And so my impression of my father was I was afraid of him, and I grew up in fear with him, all the way up through high school. I grew up in fear of him. When I was 52 years old, my father came to live with us for a brief time, and he was having a lot of problems. And all of these things that had built up in me in the memory of my dad were almost just bubbling out. And he was sitting at the kitchen table, and I said, "Dad, do you love me?" 52 years old. I don't want to cry, Faith, so. So he said, "Yes, I do love you." And I said, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Isn't that awful? 52 years. I got so angry with him, I started to literally just unload on him. I mean, in later years, when I was saved, I went to him and I asked for his forgiveness. But when you don't forgive someone, when you have hurts, people hurt, there's one of two responses. Either you lash out at the person to kind of get it out of you, or you take it on the inside and you build what I call walls. And that's how I described it when I was saved, is that the walls came down. But unforgiveness builds walls on the inside. It can build walls between us. Unforgiveness is a terrible, terrible thing you must forgive. It will destroy you if you don't. You must forgive. Anyway, I used to wander around my yard and I would talk to God. I would tell him what a nice day it was. I never asked him anything. It's an interesting habit, too, because even my prayers today, I seldom ask God for anything. I'll talk to him. But when I ask for things, I don't ask for myself. I ask for my children, or I ask for my friends. I ask for other people. I don't ask for me. But on a particular day in my backyard, on July 14th, 2006, it was a very, very bad year, almost like this year is. I get a lot of weeds out there in the garden, and I had this rose bush that I had put. I like roses. Interesting. I think I've got 5 of them around my house. But anyway, I had this rose bush, and it was next to this fence, and I had a heck of a time. It was all struggling with weeds all around it and so on and so forth, and I think that was significant, the weeds just choking the life out of this little rose bush, and I had that on my mind, and I started to pull the weeds out, and of course they were very difficult to get them out by their roots, and I asked God, I says, something about, why would you make these weeds so stubborn? Here I am, the stubborn one. And God answered me. And to this day, I'm going to tell you, even 15 years later, he answered me through my ears. I heard him. I was absolutely stunned. I went to my knees. Actually, I turned around to see who was talking to me. There was no one there. I went to my knees, and for the next 3.5 hours, I could not rise. What had pushed me there was a bad marriage. It was a bad relationship with my youngest son in particular. The feelings I had for my father. There was just so much. I had lost control of my life. I could no longer fix my own problems. I truly had come to the end of myself. And I had nowhere to turn. And God said, Jesus Christ died for you. In fact, part of it was faith. I had gone to church a few times at Southside Alliance Church, and I had gone to this dinner with John. Or actually, I went out to dinner with John, as I recall, Pastor John, and then I came back to the house, and the women were having, it's always women. Women are always in my life. I don't understand what it is. I work for a woman in the Heights. I fix ovens for women and stoves. I mean, it's women. It's always women. I don't know why God does this to me. And so here's this woman, and I'm pontificating. I'm not going wrong. I hope, yeah, maybe I am. I'm pontificating quite a bit here about trying to tell her that I had studied some of the world's religions or something like this, and they were all basically the same. And she disagreed, of course. She's absolutely right. And then she said a short prayer, and I still give her credit for this. She said, Lord, get him. And wouldn't you know it, the very next day he did. And as I was on my knees, the only way I can describe what was happening to you, because it was an intense spiritual experience, is that the walls were falling. But I consciously was forgiving everyone in my life who had ever hurt me. And it was a long list. And I was asking God to forgive me for the people who I had hurt. And the more I forgave, the more God filled me. And that's the message I want to give you today. If you do not forgive, you cannot be filled with the things of God. And God will fill you, and your heart will be free, and you'll no longer walk in fear. Do you have some people you need to forgive? I do. I have this lady right here. I forgive you. Will you forgive me?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. It's between her and I. Sometimes it just takes a while. After this happened to me, I literally lost my family for a while. My wife didn't speak to me for 3 months. She communicated with me by email. My children thought that I was in some kind of a cult down at Southside Alliance Church, or that there was something wrong with me, and they were all hopeful that eventually it would go away. Oh, Dad's onto some weird thing now. It'll all pass. I want to tell you, it has not. It has only spurred me on. And in many ways, I'm just as much on fire for God today as some people will tell you as I was 15 years ago. And now we have the unfinished business of my Father. When I was saved, I went to my Father, and I asked him to forgive me, and I forgave him. The first thing I did, I think within several days, was I called both of my sons, and I asked them to forgive me. And they said they did. So it's important, if you can, to ask for forgiveness. It's important that you understand that we are all flawed. We're all imperfect. We all need forgiveness. And we all need to give forgiveness. I used to go to my father every Sunday after church for several years. He lived with my sister in the city up on Wells Street, up on the north side. And my sister was not walking with the Lord, and so she still isn't, as far as I know. And she would get very upset with me because I would read to my father from the book of John. The reason I would read to him from the book of John was because he was what's called a deist. He believed in God, but he did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He believed that he was just a great prophet. And if you read from the book of John, you will see that that is the gospel that raises up Jesus as God himself. And he would listen very carefully. In fact, it's very interesting. My dad was a very argumentative type of man. And the only time he was ever quiet is when I read to him from the scriptures. And he would pay attention. And over the years, my dad lived to be 93 years old. Over the years, I think a lot of what I would say to him would sink in. He would ask me questions and so on. And on the day that he finally passed, and it was very interesting because 2 months before my father died, which was in 2009, as I recall, his heart, the electrical signals to his heart stopped. And the doctors told us in advance that he can't go on like this because it's impossible for your heart to beat without this constant electrical signal that stimulates it. And I remember asking me at the time, well, what's keeping him alive? And he says, well, it's been beating for 93 years and it just doesn't know enough to stop. So when he was at the hospital, I went to him alone without anyone there. And I remember telling him that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and that if he asked God to forgive him and accepted the message of redemption that Jesus delivered to us through the grace of God himself, that he would be forgiven and that he would be with the Father in heaven when he passed. And he grabbed my arm and he squeezed it. And he says, you really believe that Jesus is the Son of God? He said, yes. And 5 hours later, he was gone. I think at that point, I truly honored my father. You know, I was trying to think as I was sitting back here, and we were singing of something that I could say to you in summation of what I believe about the power of forgiveness. I can't think of anything more important to tell you than what I've already told you. And so for those who are fathers, and those who are maybe not yet fathers, we have a young man sitting over here to the right that I'm looking at. I don't know if he's a father, but at some point he may be a father. Forgive your children. They will disappoint you. They will hurt you. You will cry over them. And then there will be periods of time when you'll lift them up in triumph and you'll be so proud of them. Bear in mind that they're just as imperfect as you are. And just love them. Amen? Thank you for listening to me this morning.